What if one of the oldest stories ever whispered by humanity was never a myth, but a warning, deliberately hidden in plain sight? What if the exile of a forgotten world was not the end of a threat, but merely a pause in a cycle far older than civilization itself? Tonight, as you settle into this story, allow yourself to consider a possibility that ancient scribes, forbidden tablets, and modern anomalies seem to point toward the same unsettling truth. The Nibiru exile may be ending, and something humanity was never meant to rediscover has begun to surface again. For thousands of years, the name Nibiru has echoed through ancient records like a shadow moving between the lines of history, described not simply as a planet, but as a wandering world, a returning star, a celestial exile bound to a precise cosmic rhythm. According to the oldest Sumerian texts, Nibiru was home to the Anunnaki, beings not born of Earth, but deeply invested in its fate. These were not gods in the mythical sense, but advanced entities whose presence shaped early humanity, altered genetic paths, and left behind knowledge far beyond the capabilities of the age. Yet, what makes the story disturbing is not their arrival, but their departure. Ancient tablets do not describe the Anunnaki leaving willingly. They speak of division, of rebellion, of a fracture within their own hierarchy. Nibiru was cast out, sealed away on a long elliptical path through deep space, its return delayed by timescales almost incomprehensible to the human mind. The exile was meant to protect Earth, or perhaps to protect humanity from something far more dangerous than invasion. For centuries, this narrative was dismissed as mythology. Scholars reinterpreted the symbols, softened the language, and stripped the warnings of their urgency. But the language of the ancients was never poetic fantasy. It was technical, observational, and precise. When they wrote of a returning celestial body that would appear suddenly, disrupt the heavens, and signal the return of its creators, they were not speculating, they were recording. And now, in the modern age, something has begun to challenge that comfortable dismissal. An interstellar object designated 3I Atlas has entered observational awareness, behaving in ways that defy expectations. Its trajectory, velocity, and origin point have triggered quiet conversations in scientific circles, while public explanations remain carefully restrained. It is officially described as a rare visitor from beyond our solar system. Unofficially, it has reignited questions humanity thought were long buried. Because what the ancient records describe is not just a planet returning, but a signal, a marker, a cosmic announcement that the exile cycle is complete. Nibiru does not simply arrive. It reveals itself, and with that revelation comes the resurfacing of the Anunnaki's oldest secret, that humanity's role in this story was never passive. We were not merely created, we were prepared. This is why the silence surrounding anomalies like 3I Atlas feels so heavy, why information seems fragmented, cautious, incomplete. Because if Nibiru's exile is truly ending, then the timeline described in ancient texts has restarted, and that timeline does not end with discovery. It ends with reckoning. As you continue listening, pay attention not just to the facts, but to the patterns, to the recurring symbols, the cycles of return, the warnings repeated across civilizations that never spoke to one another, yet told the same story. Ask yourself why these stories were preserved at all, and why they are resurfacing now, at a moment when humanity is once again looking toward the stars with both hope and fear. Because if Nibiru is returning, and if 3I Atlas is more than it appears, then the question is no longer whether the Anunnaki's secret was real, but why it is being revealed at this exact point in human history. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment and reflect on what you've just heard. Stories like this are not meant to be consumed passively. They are meant to be questioned, interpreted, and understood layer by layer. So as you listen, I invite you to actively engage with this content. Understanding these ideas, whether you see them as ancient warnings, symbolic records, or suppressed history, changes the way this story unfolds. And your perspective matters here. If something you've heard resonates with you, or if a particular detail stands out, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Many of the most revealing insights come from those who notice what others overlook. Leaving a like is more than simple support. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep, reflective storytelling deserves to reach others who are searching for answers beyond the surface. And if you find yourself drawn to these ancient mysteries, to the questions surrounding Nibiru, the Anunnaki, and unexplained cosmic signals like Three-Eye Atlas, consider subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss what comes next, as this narrative continues to unfold. This journey isn't about rushing to conclusions. It's about staying curious, staying aware, and staying open as we move further into the evidence, the patterns, and the unsettling possibilities that history and the stars themselves may still be hiding from us. The idea of exile is something deeply human. We understand banishment, removal, being cast away from a place of origin, but the exile described in the oldest records humanity ever produced was not human at all. It was cosmic. It was deliberate, and it was meant to be forgotten. When ancient scribes carved their warnings into stone and clay, they were not documenting a mythological fall from grace. They were preserving the memory of a world removed from the visible order of the heavens, a wandering body deliberately pushed beyond ordinary observation, waiting for a time when its return would no longer be preventable. Nibiru is not described as a simple planet drifting through space. It is portrayed as an exiled world, one that once held authority, influence, and presence within our solar system. The language used in ancient records is precise, almost procedural. Nibiru was separated, its path altered, its return delayed through vast cycles of time. This was not a natural accident, it was a decision, and decisions imply intelligence, hierarchy, and conflict. The Anunnaki are central to this forgotten exile, not as gods crowned by worship, but as advanced beings whose existence predates human civilization. They are repeatedly associated with celestial movement, planetary cycles, and genetic intervention. According to the records, they did not simply visit Earth. They arrived with purpose. They built, instructed, altered, and then vanished. But disappearance is not the same as erasure. The exile of Nibiru did not end their influence. It concealed it. What makes the exile unsettling is the implication that it was never permanent. Ancient texts suggest that Nibiru follows a long, elongated orbit, disappearing into the outer darkness before returning once again. This cycle is described with language that suggests inevitability. There is no suggestion of if, only when. The exile was a delay, not a conclusion. Time itself was the barrier placed between humanity and whatever consequences the return would bring. Over generations, the memory of this exile was diluted. Stories became symbols. Symbols became myths. Myths were dismissed as superstition. But beneath the layers of reinterpretation, the core message remained intact. The return would be sudden. The signs would be subtle at first, and humanity would not be warned openly. The knowledge would resurface only when the cycle was already in motion. This raises a troubling question. If the exile was designed to protect Earth, what exactly was Earth being protected from? The texts hint at internal conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, a division of authority, a fracture in purpose. Some accounts describe a rebellion. Others suggest an experiment that went too far. Humanity appears repeatedly in these narratives not as a victim, but as a variable. A species created, modified, and observed. The exile may have been as much about isolating humanity as isolating Nibiru. What is often overlooked is how much effort was invested in making humanity forget. The most explicit references to Nibiru were removed, retranslated or reframed. Tablets were fragmented. Context was lost. The idea of a returning world became inconvenient to developing religious and scientific narratives alike. A predictable universe is easier to control. A universe with an exiled planet on a return trajectory is not. And yet, the memory never fully vanished. It survived in symbols of a returning star, a destroyer, a judge, a reset. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia recorded similar warnings, not copied but echoed. This consistency is what gives the exile its weight. Myths vary wildly, records do not, and the records all point to the same disturbing structure: arrival, intervention, exile, silence, return. The silence is perhaps the most important phase. During the exile, humanity was meant to develop independently, to grow without direct oversight, to forget its origins and assume ownership of Earth. This was not abandonment, it was observation at a distance. The Anunnaki's absence allowed human systems to evolve organically, while the cycle continued unseen. Nibiru's long absence was a test of memory. Would humanity remember without being reminded? Modern astronomy changed the rules. Suddenly, humanity could observe beyond the limits of the naked eye. Objects once invisible could now be tracked. The exile relied on ignorance. Technology threatens it. This is why anomalies matter. Objects that do not behave as expected challenge not just scientific models, but ancient ones. The exile becomes fragile when the sky is no longer mysterious. The designation of strange interstellar objects, unexplained trajectories and sudden appearances reactivates ancient language in a modern context. The names are different. The implications are not. The exile was supposed to keep Nibiru hidden until a specific moment. That moment, according to the texts, would coincide with humanity reaching a certain level of awareness. Not wisdom, awareness. The ability to notice, but not necessarily to understand. This is where the story becomes deeply personal, because the exile was never just about a planet. It was about us. Humanity was shaped under the shadow of a future return. Our myths, our fears, our fascination with the sky all stem from a subconscious inheritance. We sense that something is missing, that history is incomplete, that the stars know more about us than we know about ourselves. The forgotten exile is not forgotten because it failed. It is forgotten because it succeeded. It pushed the truth far enough into the past that it became deniable. But denial only works until patterns re-emerge. Cycles do not need belief to function. They only need time. And time, according to every ancient record, is running along a path already defined. As we continue, the exile stops being an abstract idea and starts to align with observable patterns, ancient timelines, and modern anomalies. But before moving forward, this is where your voice becomes part of the story. If this idea of a cosmic exile resonates with you, or if you've ever felt that humanity's history doesn't fully add up, share that in the comments. You can comment phrases like, "Nothing was erased," or "The cycle never ended." Your perspective helps shape how this conversation evolves. And if you're following closely, make sure to leave a like. It helps this kind of deep, reflective content reach others who are asking the same questions, even if they don't yet know how to articulate them. Long before humanity learned to name itself, long before memory could be passed through spoken language, there existed a presence on Earth that did not originate here. The Anunnaki are described in the oldest surviving records not as symbols or metaphors, but as beings who arrived with intention, structure, and knowledge already fully formed. They did not evolve alongside early humans. They preceded them. And that distinction changes everything about how we understand our own beginnings. The ancient texts describe a world that was already occupied, already organized, before humanity emerged as a dominant species. Earth was not empty. It was observed, measured, and prepared. The Anunnaki are consistently associated with descent from the heavens, with movement between worlds, and with authority over natural forces that early humans could not comprehend. Their arrival is never described as accidental. It is portrayed as part of a broader design, a continuation of decisions made far beyond Earth's atmosphere. What makes these accounts unsettling is their consistency. Across fragmented tablets, damaged inscriptions, and partially erased records, the Anunnaki are always depicted as beings who understood genetics, astronomy, mathematics, and planetary cycles long before humans developed writing. They are not learning as they go. They arrive already knowing. This suggests that Earth was not their first experiment, nor their first destination. Before humanity, Earth itself is described as a resource, not in the crude sense of exploitation, but as a strategic environment, a place where conditions allowed for biological manipulation, long-term habitation, and controlled development. The Anunnaki did not simply rule over Earth, they engineered systems within it. Atmospheres were measured, life was catalogued. Early hominids were observed, altered, and repurposed. Humanity, according to these records, was not a random outcome of evolution. It was an intervention. The Anunnaki before humanity were not gods seeking worship. They did not require belief. Authority was not enforced through faith, but through presence. Humans did not follow them because they were divine. They followed them because resistance was not an option. The power imbalance was absolute. The texts describe early humans as workers, attendants and caretakers, useful, adaptable, and capable of learning, but fundamentally limited without guidance. This is where the idea of creation becomes more complex. Humanity was not created from nothing. It was modified. Existing life was altered, refined, accelerated. The Anunnaki introduced something new into the biological chain, something that allowed humans to reason, to remember, and eventually to question. This gift was not purely benevolent. Intelligence created independence, independence created risk, and risk required control. Before humanity reached self-awareness, the Anunnaki governed openly. Their structures dominated landscapes that would later be mythologized as sacred sites. Their technology, misunderstood as magic, shaped stone, redirected water, and manipulated energy. These actions were not hidden. They did not need to be. There was no one capable of challenging them. Earth was quiet. Order was absolute, but the records also hint at tension. The Anunnaki were not unified. They were hierarchical, divided by purpose and authority. Some were overseers, others were enforcers, others were scientists. Decisions were debated, outcomes were contested, and humanity was placed at the center of that conflict without understanding it. Different factions viewed humanity differently, as a tool, as a liability, as a future successor, as an experiment that should never have been allowed to continue. This internal division explains much of what followed. Humanity was given knowledge in fragments. Some Anunnaki believed humans should remain limited. Others believed growth was inevitable. The tension between control and progression shaped early civilization. Writing was taught, then restricted. Astronomy was revealed, then obscured. Laws were imposed, then abandoned. Humanity was never meant to remember everything at once. Before humanity had language, the Anunnaki already understood time. They operated on cycles far beyond human lifespans. Their plans extended across thousands of years. This is why their absence later feels calculated. They did not vanish suddenly. They withdrew gradually, reducing their presence while monitoring outcomes. Humanity was allowed to struggle, to adapt, to forget. Forgetting was not a failure of the system. It was part of it. What remains haunting is that the Anunnaki never fully left. They left markers, not monuments meant to be admired, but systems meant to persist. Genetic markers, cultural patterns, psychological tendencies. Humanity inherited not just physical traits but instincts, obedience to authority, fascination with the sky, fear of judgment, longing for return. These are not accidental. They are echoes of a time when Earth was governed by beings not bound to it. The period before humanity was one of preparation. Earth was shaped into a controlled environment. When humans emerged with increased intelligence, they did so into a world already structured for governance. Kingship, hierarchy, labor, punishment. These systems did not originate organically. They were modeled after Anunnaki order. Humanity did not invent civilization from nothing. It inherited a blueprint. This reframes the idea of progress. Humanity believes it climbed upward alone. But the records suggest we were lifted, then released. The Anunnaki before humanity were not interested in creating equals. They were interested in creating something functional, something capable of sustaining itself in their absence. The exile of Nibiru later forced that absence to become permanent, at least temporarily. Humanity was left with fragments of memory and incomplete instructions. And yet, the Anunnaki anticipated this. The texts imply that humanity's curiosity would eventually lead it back to the stars, that technology would recreate ancient capabilities through different means. That observation would replace worship. Science would replace ritual, but the questions would remain the same. Who were they? Why were we made this way? And what happens when they return? The Anunnaki before humanity did not fear humans. They feared unpredictability. A species capable of thought but unaware of its origins was manageable. A species that remembers is not. This is why knowledge was compartmentalized, why some truths were encoded symbolically rather than stated directly. Humanity was meant to rediscover its past slowly, just enough to recognize patterns, not enough to change outcomes. As this story continues, the focus shifts from who the Anunnaki were to why they acted as they did, and what consequences their decisions set into motion. But before moving forward, this is where I want to hear from you. If the idea that humanity was shaped rather than born resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. You can write phrases like, "We were engineered," or "We were never alone." And if you're following closely and want to support this kind of deep exploration into ancient mysteries and lost origins, make sure to leave a like. It helps others who feel these questions but haven't yet found the words for them. The question of why Nibiru was banished is the most carefully avoided part of the entire narrative, both in ancient records and in modern interpretations. Arrival can be romanticized. Creation can be reframed as divine, but banishment implies failure, danger, and loss of control. And according to the oldest surviving descriptions, Nibiru was not exiled because it was weak, broken, or obsolete. It was exiled because it became a threat, not just to Earth, but to the Anunnaki themselves. The ancient accounts suggest that Nibiru was once fully integrated into a larger system. It was not a rogue world wandering aimlessly through space. It had a defined role, a predictable cycle, and authority tied directly to the Anunnaki hierarchy. Nibiru was described as a command world, a moving center of governance, knowledge, and power. Decisions affecting multiple worlds were made there. Earth was one of many locations under its influence, but it held special significance because of what was being developed here. The problem began when control fractured. The Anunnaki were not a single unified consciousness. They were advanced, but they were not immune to internal conflict. The records hint at ideological divisions, disagreements over how far intervention should go, how much autonomy should be granted to created species, and whether humanity represented a success or a catastrophic mistake. Nibiru became the center of this conflict, not because of its orbit, but because of what it represented: authority without consensus. One faction believed humanity should remain permanently subordinate: limited intelligence, controlled reproduction, strict oversight. Another faction believed humanity could eventually become something more, perhaps even a successor species capable of sustaining Earth independently. This disagreement was not philosophical. It had consequences. Experiments intensified. Genetic thresholds were crossed. Knowledge was given, then taken away. Humanity became unstable, unpredictable, capable of rebellion, not through strength, but through awareness. This instability echoed back to Nibiru. The texts describe disruptions that were not merely political, but environmental and energetic. Nibiru itself was affected by prolonged exposure to experimental technologies, resource extraction, and deep space manipulation. Its orbit became less stable. Its internal systems were strained, but the greatest danger was not physical. It was informational. Knowledge that should have remained contained began to spread beyond intended boundaries. At some point, the Anunnaki realized that Nibiru could no longer remain where it was. Too many variables were in motion. Humanity was changing faster than anticipated. Earth was becoming less controllable. And Nibiru, instead of acting as a stabilizing force, was amplifying the problem. The decision to banish it was not immediate. It was debated, delayed, resisted, but ultimately enforced. The banishment of Nibiru was an act of containment. Its orbit was altered deliberately, forced into a long, elongated cycle that would remove it from direct interaction with the inner system for vast periods of time. This was not destruction. Destruction would have been simpler. This was isolation. Nibiru was sent away, not erased, because its return was still considered necessary, just not yet. Time became the solution. Time would reset conditions. Time would allow memories to fade. Time would turn active knowledge into myth. What makes this exile particularly disturbing is that it was never framed as permanent. The ancient language used to describe the banishment emphasizes return. Again and again, the texts speak of separation until the appointed cycle completes. This implies that the banishment was conditional. Nibiru was removed until certain conditions were met. And those conditions were not astronomical alone. They were human. Humanity's development became the deciding factor. The Anunnaki believed that given enough time, without direct oversight, humans would either collapse back into primitive chaos or stabilize into a self-governing civilization. Either outcome reduced risk. A collapsed species would pose no threat. A stable one could be managed indirectly. What could not be allowed was a species that remembered too much, too soon, while still being emotionally volatile. The exile also served another purpose: accountability. Some Anunnaki factions were blamed for the situation escalating beyond control. Banishment was not only about removing a planet, but about removing influence. Those aligned most closely with radical experimentation lost direct access to Earth. Oversight was decentralized, authority was fragmented. This explains why post-exile interactions with humanity became inconsistent, rare, and symbolic rather than direct. After Nibiru's banishment, the Anunnaki presence on Earth diminished rapidly, not because they vanished, but because the system that supported their governance was gone. Without Nibiru as a central hub, long-term coordination became difficult. Individual Anunnaki groups withdrew, some leaving entirely, others embedding themselves within emerging human power structures. This is where kingship myths begin, gods walking among men, bloodlines claiming divine descent. These are not fantasies. They are remnants of a collapsing system adapting to survival mode. The exile changed everything. Humanity was no longer actively managed. We were observed at a distance. Interventions became subtle rather than overt. Knowledge was encoded instead of taught. Symbols replaced instruction. Fear replaced authority. The Anunnaki shifted from rulers to watchers. And Nibiru, once the center of command, became a distant reminder of consequences deferred. Over time, the true reason for the banishment was intentionally obscured. It was safer for humanity to believe Nibiru was a destroyer, a harbinger of doom, rather than a controlled entity removed because of internal failure. Fear is easier to manage than understanding. A monster in the sky discourages curiosity. A failed system invites questions, but the records still leak fragments of truth. They describe Nibiru not attacking Earth, but destabilizing systems, not invading, but triggering resets. The catastrophe associated with its cycles is not random destruction, but systemic correction. Floods, collapses, mass extinctions. These are not acts of anger. They are acts of recalibration. Nibiru was designed to restore balance, even if that balance required erasing civilizations that had grown beyond their parameters. This reframes the exile as something even more dangerous. Nibiru was not banished because it was hostile. It was banished because it was functional. Its role conflicted with evolving ethical boundaries among the Anunnaki themselves. What one faction saw as necessary correction, another saw as unacceptable loss. The compromise was exile, delay the correction, let humanity progress further. See what happens. And now, that delay appears to be ending. The banishment only works as long as the cycle remains hidden. As long as humanity lacks the ability to detect, measure, and interpret deep space anomalies accurately. But once observation improves, once patterns become visible again, the exile loses its effectiveness. Nibiru does not need to announce itself. Its influence alone is enough to restart dormant systems, awaken old protocols, and trigger memories embedded deep within human culture. This is why modern anomalies matter so much, not because they prove Nibiru directly, but because they indicate that the isolation phase is weakening. The conditions that justified the banishment are changing. Humanity is no longer the same species it was during the last cycle. We are technologically aware, globally connected, and psychologically restless. We look for origins. We question authority. We search the sky. And that search is not accidental. As we move forward, the focus shifts from the banishment itself to the signs that the cycle is reactivating and what that means for humanity now. But before we go deeper, this is another moment where your perspective adds weight to the conversation. If the idea that Nibiru was banished to delay a correction resonates with you, leave a comment with phrases like, "The exile was a delay," or "It was never destroyed." And if this exploration is holding your attention, make sure to leave a like. It helps this kind of long-form, reflective storytelling reach others who feel that something in our history and our future doesn't quite align. After the banishment of Nibiru, the most dangerous thing the Anunnaki left behind was not technology, bloodlines, or monuments. It was information, not spoken openly, not taught directly, but embedded quietly into records designed to survive collapse. The silent warnings in ancient texts were never meant to alarm the masses. They were meant to endure, to remain dormant until the moment humanity developed the ability to recognize patterns again. These warnings do not appear as direct statements. They are layered, symbolic, fragmented, and often intentionally incomplete. Ancient scribes did not write them as historians. They wrote them as witnesses under instruction. The language they used reflects constraint. Certain ideas are repeated obsessively, while others are carefully avoided. When they speak of a returning star, a wandering world, or a great cycle that resets ages, they are not speculating. They are documenting a protocol they were told not to fully explain. What makes these texts unsettling is not what they say, but how consistently they say it across cultures that had no contact with one another. Different names, different symbols, same structure, a time before humanity, beings from the heavens, intervention, withdrawal, silence, and then a return that would coincide with upheaval in the sky and disorder on Earth. These are not myths trying to explain nature. They are records trying to preserve memory without triggering panic. The silence in these warnings is deliberate. There are no dates given, no exact measurements, no instructions on how to prevent what is coming. This suggests that prevention was never the goal. Awareness was. The texts are designed to be rediscovered, not obeyed, to provoke recognition rather than action. The Anunnaki did not want humanity to stop the cycle. They wanted humanity to understand it when it restarted. Many of these records describe signs rather than events, changes in the heavens, unusual celestial movements, stars that appear where they should not, objects that arrive without warning and defy expectation. The language often emphasizes watching, counting, observing, not praying, not fighting, watching. This implies that by the time the signs appear, intervention is no longer possible. The role of humanity is not to resist the return, but to witness it consciously. Another recurring theme in these texts is timing. Not linear time, but cyclical time. Ages rise and fall. Civilizations bloom and vanish. Humanity believes history moves forward. The ancient warnings suggest history loops. Each cycle leaves behind fragments of memory, stories of floods, fires from the sky, days when the sun behaved strangely. These are not isolated disasters. They are markers of reset points tied to the same celestial trigger. The warnings are silent because they were never meant to be understood all at once. Understanding too early would destabilize humanity. Fear would spread. Authority would fracture. The Anunnaki understood that knowledge without context is dangerous, so they buried context and preserved structure. They trusted time to do the rest. Time would decide when humanity was ready to see the pattern rather than just the story. It is also important to recognize what is missing from these texts. There are no clear descriptions of battle, no heroic resistance, no divine salvation. Humanity is not portrayed as a central actor in the return. We are observers again, just as we were at the beginning. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable warning of all. The cycle does not revolve around us. We exist within it. Some records hint that previous civilizations may have recognized the signs and attempted to warn future generations. Their warnings were ignored, mythologized, or erased. Their collapse became a lesson encoded rather than explained. Stone structures aligned with stars, calendars tracking long cycles. Oral traditions passed through ritual rather than logic. All of this points to a single purpose: preserve awareness without triggering rebellion or despair. The silence is also psychological. The warnings speak to intuition rather than intellect. They are meant to be felt before they are understood. A sense that something ancient is returning. A familiarity with fear that cannot be traced to personal experience. A pull toward the sky during moments of uncertainty. These reactions are not learned, they are inherited. Humanity carries memory deeper than language. What the texts never do is reassure. There is no promise that the return will be gentle. There is no claim that humanity will be spared. Instead, there is an acceptance that cycles are indifferent. Survival is not guaranteed. Continuity is. Life continues, but not always in recognizable form. This is why the warnings focus on awareness rather than survival. Awareness is the only thing that can persist through reset. As centuries passed, institutions reframed these warnings to maintain control. Returning stars became divine judgment. Cycles became moral punishment. Fear was redirected inward rather than outward. Humanity was taught to blame itself rather than look to the sky. This was not accidental. It was a continuation of the original containment strategy. If humanity fears itself, it will not question the heavens. But now, those silent warnings are becoming audible again. Not because the texts changed, but because humanity did. We have the tools to detect anomalies. We track objects beyond our solar system. We measure trajectories and origins. We notice when something does not fit expected models, and when that happens, ancient language suddenly feels less symbolic and more technical. This is the moment the warnings were waiting for, not revelation, but recognition. The realization that ancient observers were describing the same behaviors we are seeing now, the same patterns, the same silence before change. The texts do not tell us what will happen next. They tell us that something always happens next. And this is where the narrative tightens, because once the signs are recognized, the cycle accelerates. Awareness spreads unevenly. Some deny, some panic, some search for meaning. The warnings anticipated this division. They were never meant to unify humanity. They were meant to divide perception. Those who see the pattern cannot unsee it. Those who dismiss it remain comfortable until disruption becomes unavoidable. As we continue, we move from ancient warnings to modern observation, from symbols carved into stone to data captured by instruments. The silence begins to break, not through prophecy, but through detection. But before we step fully into that shift, this is another moment where your voice adds depth to the conversation. If you feel that ancient texts were warning rather than storytelling, leave a comment with phrases like, "The warnings were silent," or "They were watching the sky." And if this kind of slow, immersive exploration is keeping you engaged, take a second to leave a like. It helps this content reach others who sense that these ancient records were never meant to stay buried forever. Once the silent warnings are recognized, the next layer reveals itself naturally. Repetition, not coincidence, not chaos, but pattern. The pattern of the return is not described in ancient records as a single catastrophic moment, but as a sequence, predictable, gradual, and deeply unsettling in its precision. The Anunnaki did not leave humanity guessing blindly. They embedded recurrence into the very structure of the warning itself. What returns does so because it has returned before. Ancient observers did not think in straight lines. They thought in cycles. Time was not an arrow moving forward, but a wheel turning endlessly. Civilizations rose, collapsed, and were forgotten, not because of human failure alone, but because the environment they existed within was never stable. The sky itself was part of the cycle. When the heavens changed, everything below followed. The pattern always begins quietly. There is no announcement, no sudden arrival. Just subtle irregularities that only those paying close attention would notice. A shift in celestial behavior. Objects appearing from directions not typically associated with stable orbits, movements that seem intentional rather than random. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize the importance of watching because the return never announces itself as a threat. It announces itself as an anomaly. This is where the danger lies. Anomalies are easy to dismiss. They can be explained away, minimized, or reframed as rare but natural occurrences. The pattern depends on disbelief in its early stages. Only later, when multiple anomalies begin to align, does recognition set in. By then, according to the records, the cycle has already passed the point of intervention. The return follows a rhythm that extends beyond human lifespans. This is why it feels invisible to short-term observation. One generation sees nothing, another sees hints. A third begins to notice consistency. By the time the pattern becomes undeniable, centuries have passed. The Anunnaki understood this limitation. They designed the cycle to operate on a scale that discourages unified human response. Ancient calendars were not agricultural tools alone. They tracked long counts, deep time, and rare alignments. These were not meant for daily use. They were meant to preserve memory across collapse. When a civilization fell, the stone remained. When language changed, the pattern endured. These calendars did not predict dates. They marked intervals. The return was not tied to a single moment, but to the completion of a sequence. The pattern also includes human behavior. This is often overlooked. Each cycle is accompanied by similar social conditions: fragmentation, rapid technological advancement, loss of shared narrative, obsession with origins, and fear of extinction. Humanity begins to look backward and upward at the same time. Ancient texts suggest this is not coincidence. The return activates something within human consciousness, a latent memory responding to external stimulus. This psychological component is critical. The Anunnaki understood that humanity would not recognize the return by sight alone. We would feel it first: unease, restlessness, a sense that history is accelerating, that time itself feels compressed. These sensations are recorded symbolically as omens, dreams, and divine messages, but they are better understood as cognitive responses to environmental and cosmic change. The pattern is reinforced through repetition of catastrophe: floods, fires, darkness, sudden climate shifts. These events are not described as punishment, they are described as consequences. When Nibiru approaches, its influence destabilizes systems already under strain. Gravity, electromagnetic fields, and atmospheric conditions fluctuate. Weak points collapse, strong systems adapt. Civilization is tested, not judged. What is consistent across records is that survival is uneven. Some groups endure, others vanish completely. Knowledge is lost selectively. This is not random. The pattern favors decentralization. Centralized systems collapse harder. Flexible ones persist. The Anunnaki were not interested in preserving specific cultures. They were interested in preserving the experiment. Humanity as a whole continues, even if its expressions change. The return pattern also includes denial. Each cycle features authorities who dismiss warnings, reinterpret signs, and suppress discussion. This is not because they are malicious, but because the implications threaten stability. A predictable universe is manageable. A cyclical one is not. Institutions built on permanence struggle to accept impermanence. The pattern depends on this resistance. It delays mass recognition until disruption becomes unavoidable. Ancient texts describe moments when the pattern was partially recognized. Attempts were made to warn future generations more clearly, but clarity created panic. Panic created collapse. The Anunnaki learned that ambiguity was safer. Better to leave questions than answers. Better to provoke curiosity than fear. This is why the pattern is hinted at rather than explained. As the return progresses, signs begin to cluster. One anomaly can be ignored, several cannot. The sky becomes crowded with questions, objects with unusual trajectories, behaviors that defy expectation, gaps in existing models. At this stage, ancient language shifts from symbolic to urgent. The tone changes, watchers become messengers, silence becomes anticipation. The most unsettling aspect of the pattern is that it does not end with arrival. Arrival is only the midpoint. What follows is adjustment. Systems reset, hierarchies change, knowledge is redistributed. The world does not end, it transforms. Humanity survives, but not unchanged. This is why the pattern is feared more than extinction. Extinction is final. Transformation is unpredictable. The pattern also suggests that memory persists beyond collapse, not consciously, but culturally. Each new civilization inherits fragments of fear, fascination, and longing. The sky remains central to meaning. Stories of gods returning never disappear completely. They resurface whenever humanity reaches similar thresholds of awareness. The pattern does not need to be taught. It reactivates itself. This is why modern observation feels so familiar to ancient language. The tools are different, the mindset is not. We are watching again, measuring again, debating again, denying again. The same cycle of curiosity and resistance unfolds. The pattern is not repeating because humanity failed to learn. It repeats because repetition is the mechanism. As the return advances, the pattern accelerates. Time feels compressed because the intervals between signs shorten. Ancient records describe this compression as a tightening of the cycle. What once took centuries now unfolds in decades. Awareness spreads faster, resistance becomes louder. The pattern adapts to technological speed. This brings us to the present moment. The pattern has reached a stage where recognition is possible without belief. You do not need faith to notice repetition. You only need comparison. Ancient records describe behaviors we now observe, not conclusions, behaviors, and behavior is harder to dismiss. As we continue forward, the narrative moves from pattern recognition to modern confirmation, from cycles recorded in stone to anomalies tracked by instruments. But before we step fully into that transition, this is another moment where your insight adds value. If you notice patterns repeating across history, leave a comment with phrases like, "History is cyclical," or "The pattern always returns." And if this unfolding exploration is keeping you engaged, leaving a like helps this kind of long-form reflective content reach others who feel that something ancient is repeating itself, whether they can explain it yet or not. When ancient patterns intersect with modern observation, something changes in the tone of the story. The narrative stops feeling symbolic and begins to feel immediate. This is exactly where 3i Atlas enters the picture, not as proof, not as revelation, but as disruption. A modern anomaly that behaves just strangely enough to reopen questions humanity believed were safely buried beneath layers of explanation and reassurance. What makes 3i Atlas unsettling is not simply that it exists, but that it does not fit comfortably within expectation. Humanity has become very good at categorizing the sky. We label, classify, predict, and normalize celestial objects until they lose their mystery. But every so often, something appears that refuses to settle into those categories, something whose behavior demands attention rather than dismissal. Ancient texts describe this exact moment as the point when watching turns into recognition. In the records, the return never begins with the main event. It begins with a precursor, a messenger, an anomaly that forces observers to recalibrate their assumptions. 3i Atlas occupies that role disturbingly well. It arrives not with spectacle, but with quiet defiance of prediction. Its trajectory suggests origin beyond familiar boundaries. Its motion challenges the comfort of routine explanation. It is not dramatic enough to cause panic, yet unusual enough to resist complete indifference. This balance is important. The Anunnaki warnings describe precursors as intentionally ambiguous. Too obvious, and humanity panics. Too subtle, and nothing is noticed. The anomaly must exist in a narrow window where curiosity grows faster than fear. 3i Atlas sits precisely in that space. It invites conversation without demanding belief. And that is how patterns reactivate. Ancient observers spoke of signs that would appear out of place, moving against expectation, arriving from regions of the sky not associated with predictable cycles. These signs were not described as Nibiru itself, but as indicators that the system had shifted, like ripples before a wave. The return, according to the texts, announces itself indirectly first, through anomalies that do not belong, yet cannot be ignored. Modern science often treats anomalies as temporary problems to be solved, rather than signals to be interpreted. This mindset is effective, but it has limits. When something behaves in ways that require constant qualification, explanation begins to sound defensive, and defense is often the first reaction to disruption. The ancient records anticipated this. They describe authorities minimizing early signs, reframing them as rare but harmless, emphasizing normalcy even as inconsistencies accumulate. What makes 3i Atlas especially compelling in this context is not what is said about it, but what is not. Language becomes careful. Statements remain narrow. Speculation is discouraged. This mirrors the pattern described in ancient cycles, where early anomalies are surrounded by silence rather than alarm. Silence is not absence of concern, it is management of perception. From the Anunnaki perspective, perception mattered more than knowledge. Humanity could know fragments, but not the full structure. Knowing too much too quickly destabilized societies in previous cycles, so the return pattern was designed to unfold gradually, allowing adaptation rather than collapse. 3i Atlas fits into this logic as an opening move, not a final statement. The anomaly also reignites something psychological. Humans respond differently to interstellar objects than to familiar ones. They feel less predictable, less bound, more intentional. Ancient language often frames these precursors as watchers or heralds, not because they are conscious, but because they trigger awareness. The sky feels less passive, less distant, more involved. This sense of involvement is critical. The return is not merely physical, it is perceptual. Humanity begins to feel observed again. The ancient texts suggest that this feeling precedes any direct consequence. It creates unease, curiosity, and obsession. People start connecting dots across disciplines that rarely communicate. Astronomy intersects with mythology. Physics brushes against memory. The sky stops being neutral. 3i Atlas also challenges linear thinking. If it originated beyond the solar system, then it carries with it the implication that our local environment is not isolated. Ancient records emphasize this repeatedly. Earth was never alone. It existed within a larger system of movement, influence, and observation. The anomaly reminds modern humanity of that uncomfortable truth. What the pattern warns against is premature certainty. Declaring an anomaly nothing too quickly is just as dangerous as declaring it everything. The Anunnaki texts describe knowledge withheld not to deceive, but to pace awareness. Humanity learns best through tension, not answers. An unresolved anomaly holds attention. It keeps the mind engaged. It prevents complacency. This tension is where transformation begins. The return does not start with impact. It starts with questions, questions that refuse to disappear, questions that linger even after explanations are offered. 3i Atlas becomes one of those questions, not because it proves anything, but because it refuses to fully resolve into comfort. Ancient observers understood that once anomalies appeared, attention would follow. Attention leads to scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to comparison. Comparison leads to pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is the point of no return. You cannot unsee a pattern once it becomes clear. This is why early signs are always ambiguous. They invite observation without forcing belief. Another unsettling aspect of the anomaly is timing. It appears during a period when humanity is already questioning its origins, its future, and its place in the universe. Ancient cycles describe this convergence as intentional. The return aligns with moments of existential uncertainty, when societies are fragmented, when authority is questioned, when technology accelerates faster than wisdom. These conditions are not accidental. They are part of the setup. The Anunnaki warnings suggest that the return is less disruptive to a unified humanity than to a divided one. Division amplifies impact. Conflicting interpretations create friction. Friction creates collapse or adaptation. The anomaly does not need to cause damage directly. It destabilizes by provoking disagreement about meaning. This is why 3i Atlas matters, even if it turns out to be nothing unusual by conventional standards. Its role is not to be extraordinary. Its role is to reopen the conversation, to reactivate ancient language in a modern context, to remind humanity that the sky has always been part of the story, not just the backdrop. As observation continues, anomalies accumulate. One becomes two, two become patterns, patterns become cycles. The ancient texts describe this progression with quiet inevitability. There is no urgency in their tone, only certainty. The return does not rush. It waits for recognition to spread organically, and recognition is spreading, not universally, not loudly, but persistently. Curiosity replaces dismissal, questions replace conclusions. The anomaly becomes a reference point, a marker in time when something shifted in how humanity looks upward. As we move forward, the focus will shift again, from the anomaly itself to the silence surrounding it, to the reasons certain conversations remain constrained, to the space between what is observed and what is shared. But before we cross into that territory, this is another moment where your perspective adds meaning to the discussion. If you feel that anomalies like Three-Eye Atlas serve as signals rather than answers, leave a comment with phrases like, "Anomalies are warnings," or "The pattern is waking up." And if this unfolding narrative is keeping you engaged, leaving a like helps this kind of slow, immersive exploration reach others who are beginning to sense that something in the sky no longer fits the old explanations. Silence is rarely accidental, especially when it appears at moments where curiosity should naturally explode. When something challenges established models, when anomalies refuse to settle neatly into expectation, the instinctive response would be open debate, rapid analysis, and transparent discussion. Yet what often emerges instead is restraint, carefully chosen language, narrow statements, a noticeable absence of urgency. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. Why are scientists not talking in the way we would expect? The answer is not as simple as secrecy or deception. In fact, the silence surrounding anomalies like Three-Eye Atlas reflects a deeper tension between knowledge, responsibility, and consequence. Science does not exist in isolation. It is embedded within institutions, funding structures, governments, and public trust. When an observation threatens to destabilize not just a theory, but a worldview, caution replaces curiosity. Ancient records anticipated this reaction with unsettling accuracy. They describe periods when watchers in the sky were noticed again, but discussion remained constrained, not because the signs were insignificant, but because their implications reached beyond the sky and into the foundations of society. Knowledge, in these moments, becomes dangerous not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. Scientists are trained to avoid speculation. This discipline is what makes science reliable. But it also creates blind spots when evidence does not yet fit within existing frameworks. An anomaly that cannot be fully explained is not immediately embraced as revolutionary. It is isolated, studied quietly, reframed cautiously. The public-facing narrative remains conservative, even when private discussion becomes intense. This gap between internal debate and external silence is not new. It mirrors the pattern described in ancient cycles, where early signs of the return were acknowledged by observers, but withheld from broader populations. The reasoning was always the same. Premature awareness causes instability. Fear spreads faster than understanding, and fear reshapes behavior in unpredictable ways. Modern humanity is more connected than ever, but also more fragile. Information moves instantly, without context, without patience. A single misunderstood statement can spiral into panic, misinformation, or mass distraction. Scientists are aware of this. They know that uncertainty does not travel well. Silence becomes a form of containment. There is also the matter of professional survival. Careers are built on credibility, not speculation. When an anomaly challenges foundational assumptions, speaking too openly too soon risks reputation, funding, and institutional trust. The safest response is restraint. Carefully framed conclusions, emphasis on normalcy. This does not mean nothing unusual is happening. It means the cost of being wrong is perceived as higher than the cost of waiting. Ancient texts describe this dynamic almost clinically. They speak of keepers of knowledge, who understood the cycle but chose silence over revelation, not because they wanted to deceive, but because they believed humanity could not handle the truth without fracturing. This belief may or may not be justified, but it is persistent. Another factor is fragmentation. Science today is deeply specialized. No single individual holds the full picture. An anomaly might appear insignificant within one narrow field, while being deeply unsettling when viewed holistically. Ancient observers did not divide knowledge this way. They connected astronomy, biology, psychology, and governance into a single framework. Modern systems separate them, slowing recognition of patterns that exist across disciplines. This fragmentation creates plausible deniability. Each expert sees only a fragment. No one feels responsible for sounding the alarm. The silence is not orchestrated. It emerges naturally from compartmentalization, and yet the effect is the same as intentional suppression. The Anunnaki warnings suggest that this phase of silence is critical. It delays collective awareness long enough for the cycle to advance without interference, not because interference could stop it, but because resistance would cause unnecessary collapse. The return, according to the records, unfolds best when humanity remains divided between curiosity and dismissal. Scientists also understand something the public often underestimates: the psychological impact of cosmic insignificance. Humanity's identity is fragile. We rely on narratives of control, progress, and mastery. The suggestion that our planet exists within a recurring cycle, influenced by forces beyond our control, undermines that narrative. Even if the data is inconclusive, the implication alone is destabilizing. This is why language matters so much. Words like unusual are preferred over anomalous. Rare replaces unexpected. Harmless becomes a default assumption. These choices are not lies. They are buffers. They slow emotional response while understanding catches up. Ancient texts emphasize that the return is not meant to be announced. It is meant to be noticed. There is a difference. Announcement implies authority. Notice implies readiness. Humanity was never meant to be told outright. We were meant to connect the dots ourselves, gradually, unevenly, and without consensus. This creates another uncomfortable reality. Silence forces responsibility onto the observer. When no one tells you what to think, you must decide for yourself. This is precisely what the ancient records describe as the turning point of the cycle. Authority fades, interpretation fragments. Individuals begin to trust pattern over proclamation. The silence also protects institutions from being forced into positions they cannot sustain. If a scientist openly acknowledges uncertainty that challenges foundational models, they invite scrutiny not just of the anomaly, but of the entire system. Institutions built on predictability struggle with uncertainty. Silence buys time. But time is not neutral. As anomalies accumulate, silence becomes more noticeable. Absence of discussion becomes a signal in itself. People begin to ask not just what is being observed, but why reactions feel muted. Suspicion grows not because of evidence, but because of restraint. Ancient cycles describe this phase as the awakening of suspicion, not fear, not belief, but suspicion. A subtle sense that something important is being handled quietly. This suspicion spreads laterally through conversation, intuition, and shared unease. It does not require proof. It requires inconsistency. The Anunnaki warning suggests that once suspicion spreads, the cycle accelerates. Attention sharpens. Patterns become harder to ignore. Silence no longer contains curiosity. It amplifies it. What was meant to stabilize perception begins to destabilize it instead. This is where humanity currently stands, between explanation and silence, between observation and acknowledgement. Scientists are not talking loudly because they cannot yet speak responsibly. But their restraint speaks in its own way. It tells us that something does not fit easily, that certainty has not yet caught up to observation. And this is not the end of the silence. It is only its most noticeable phase. What follows is not sudden revelation, but gradual leakage, unofficial discussions, side comments, shifts in tone, new questions allowed to surface. The silence thins, not because truth is revealed, but because it becomes harder to maintain. As this narrative continues, we move closer to the core tension, the difference between what humanity is allowed to know and what it is ready to understand. But before we go further, this is another moment where your perspective matters. If you feel that silence itself can be a signal, leave a comment with phrases like "silence speaks loudly" or "they know more than they say." And if this kind of slow, reflective exploration is holding your attention, leaving a like helps this content reach others who sense that the quiet surrounding these anomalies may be more revealing than the explanations offered so far. The oldest secret the Anunnaki carried was never about where they came from, how advanced they were, or even why they came to Earth. Those truths were always destined to surface eventually. Civilizations rise, records survive, patterns repeat. Origins can be rediscovered. Technology can be reverse-engineered. But the secret they guarded most carefully was far more unsettling, because it placed humanity at the center of the cycle rather than on its edges. The Anunnaki's oldest secret was this: humanity was never meant to remain ignorant forever, but we were never meant to remember all at once. From the earliest interventions, the Anunnaki understood that intelligence without context creates instability. Awareness without restraint leads to rebellion, collapse, and extinction. They had seen it before, not on Earth, but elsewhere. Earth was not the first place where a developing species crossed a threshold too quickly, and it would not be the last. Humanity, from the beginning, was shaped as a controlled variable within a much larger experiment. The secret was not that humans were created or modified. That truth was always recoverable. The real secret was why memory itself was fragmented, why knowledge was distributed unevenly, why some truths were encoded symbolically while others were erased entirely. Humanity was designed to rediscover its origins slowly, painfully, and unevenly, generation by generation, never fast enough to stop the cycle, but never slow enough to forget it completely. The Anunnaki understood something profound about consciousness. Memory does not need to be explicit to be powerful. Subconscious inheritance is more resilient than written history. So instead of leaving clear instructions, they embedded instincts, longing for the sky, fear of judgment from above, obsession with origins, the belief that something important was lost. These were not cultural accidents, they were psychological anchors. This is why every civilization developed stories of gods who left and promised to return. Why humans instinctively associate the heavens with authority, fate, and reckoning. These ideas were never taught in full. They were seeded. Humanity did not remember the Anunnaki because we were told to. We remembered them because forgetting entirely would have broken the experiment. The Anunnaki's oldest secret also involved timing. Humanity was never meant to confront its creators while still dependent. The return could not happen while humans lacked technology, global awareness, and the ability to observe the sky independently. At the same time, the return could not wait until humanity became unified, calm, and fully self-aware. The return requires tension, fragmentation, questioning. A species advanced enough to notice patterns, but divided enough to argue about their meaning. This is why the exile of Nibiru was paired with human development. Time was the balancing mechanism. As Nibiru moved away, humanity moved forward. As memory faded, curiosity grew. The Anunnaki calculated that by the time the cycle reactivated, humans would be capable of observation without certainty. That state, uncertain awareness, is the ideal condition for the next phase. The secret, then, was not simply that Nibiru would return, it was that humanity would be psychologically ready to recognize the return without being emotionally ready to accept its implications. Recognition without acceptance creates friction. Friction drives transformation. Another layer of the secret lies in responsibility. The Anunnaki did not see themselves as eternal rulers. They saw themselves as initiators. Their role was to start systems, not to maintain them indefinitely. Humanity was never meant to be permanently governed, but we were never meant to be entirely free either. Freedom without memory is chaos. Memory without freedom is stagnation. The Anunnaki balance both by controlling access to truth. This is why the oldest records never present the Anunnaki as benevolent saviors or cruel tyrants. They are presented as administrators of cycles, detached, calculated, sometimes compassionate, sometimes ruthless. Their decisions were not moral in the human sense. They were structural. Earth, humanity, and Nibiru were components of a system designed to reset rather than conclude. The greatest danger from their perspective was not extinction, it was divergence. A species that breaks the cycle entirely becomes unpredictable. Humanity was never meant to escape the cycle. We were meant to understand it just enough to endure it. This secret explains why there are no instructions for survival in the ancient warnings, no guidance on how to stop the return, no technology hidden away to shield humanity from what comes next. Survival was never guaranteed, continuity was. Humanity continues through adaptation, not preservation. Civilizations are expendable, consciousness is not. The Anunnaki also understood that the moment humanity discovered this secret fully, authority would collapse. Not political authority, but existential authority. If humans realized they were participants in a recurring system rather than masters of destiny, control narratives would fail. Religion, ideology, and progress myths would fracture. This knowledge could not be released prematurely. So the secret was hidden in plain sight, in contradictions, in incomplete records, in myths that almost make sense but never quite align. Humanity was encouraged to argue about details while missing the structure. Gods versus aliens, myth versus science, symbol versus literal. These debates were distractions. The cycle does not require agreement to function. The return of Nibiru, then, is not a punishment. It is not a rescue. It is a checkpoint, a moment when systems are evaluated and recalibrated. The Anunnaki's oldest secret is that humanity itself is part of that calibration. Our reactions, our divisions, our adaptability, these are data. This is why the return is always preceded by confusion rather than clarity. Why signs appear before explanations, why silence dominates authority figures, why anomalies emerge before consensus. Humanity must respond organically. Any attempt to guide us too directly would invalidate the outcome. The most unsettling implication of the secret is this: the Anunnaki did not need to remain present to influence the future. Once the system was set in motion, it became self-correcting. Nibiru's exile, humanity's development, memory fragmentation, and eventual recognition were all components of a closed loop. The return does not reactivate the past. It tests the present. And this is where everything converges. The silence of scientists, the re-emergence of anomalies, the psychological unease, the obsession with origins. These are not random symptoms. They are indicators that humanity is approaching the awareness threshold the Anunnaki anticipated. The secret was never meant to be dramatic. It was meant to be unavoidable. As we move forward from here, the question shifts from what the Anunnaki hid to what happens when that hidden structure becomes visible again. Not all at once, not clearly, but enough to disrupt comfort and demand interpretation. And before we continue into that next phase, this is another moment where your perspective becomes part of the record. If the idea that humanity was designed to rediscover truth gradually resonates with you, leave a comment with phrases like, "We were meant to remember slowly," or "The secret was timing." And if this journey through ancient cycles, lost knowledge, and cosmic return is keeping you engaged, leaving a like helps this kind of deep, reflective storytelling reach others who feel that humanity's history and future may be far more structured than we were ever told. If the Anunnaki's oldest secret was timing, then the most unsettling realization is this: the signs do not arrive all at once. They accumulate, they overlap, they feel ordinary when isolated and undeniable when viewed together. The signs we are already seeing are not dramatic announcements written across the sky. They are shifts, quiet, persistent, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. One of the earliest signs described in ancient records is acceleration. Not speed in the mechanical sense, but compression of experience. Time feels shorter. Events stack closer together. Crises overlap rather than resolve. Humanity senses that history is moving faster than it should. This sensation appears repeatedly in ancient language, described as the tightening of the cycle. When the return approaches, intervals collapse. What once unfolded over centuries begins to occur within decades, then years. Another sign is fragmentation of shared reality. Truth becomes disputed. Authority weakens, consensus dissolves. Ancient texts never describe unity before the return. They describe division, competing narratives, conflicting interpretations of the same signs, humanity arguing not about what is happening but about what it means. This fragmentation is not a failure of society. It is a condition of the cycle. A divided species responds more authentically than a unified one guided by a single imposed explanation. There is also the re-emergence of origin obsession. Humanity begins looking backward with unusual intensity. Ancient civilizations, lost knowledge, pre-human histories, genetic mysteries. The question, "Where did we come from?" resurfaces with urgency, not as philosophy, but as identity crisis. This obsession appears in every previous cycle. When the return nears, humans instinctively search for beginnings, as if trying to orient themselves before a reset. The sky itself becomes psychologically louder, not necessarily more dangerous, but more present. Increased attention to near-Earth objects, interstellar visitors, unexplained trajectories, and cosmic anomalies reflects not just scientific progress, but emotional readiness. Ancient records suggest that humanity begins to look up more often before the return, driven by an inherited sense that answers are no longer confined to Earth. Another sign appears in the breakdown of permanence. Institutions that once felt immovable begin to feel fragile. Economic systems fluctuate, political structures polarize, cultural norms dissolve and reform rapidly. This instability mirrors descriptions of previous cycles, where rigid systems failed first. The return does not destroy stability directly. It exposes systems that cannot adapt. Technology plays a crucial role here. Ancient texts could not describe it directly, but they anticipated its function. Tools that increase observation without increasing wisdom accelerate recognition. Humanity can now detect, measure, and record anomalies faster than it can agree on interpretation. This imbalance creates tension. Knowledge expands faster than meaning. There is also a resurgence of symbolic language. Dreams, art, stories, and media increasingly reference themes of return, watchers, ancient beings, and forgotten histories. This is not coincidence. Ancient cycles describe a reactivation of symbolic memory before conscious recognition. Humanity begins expressing ideas it does not yet fully understand. Culture becomes a rehearsal space for awareness. Environmental instability is another recurring sign, not as punishment but as sensitivity. Systems become more reactive. Small disruptions create large consequences. Ancient records describe this as a thinning of margins. The world becomes less forgiving of imbalance. This does not mean catastrophe is inevitable. It means resilience is tested continuously. Perhaps the most overlooked sign is emotional polarization. Fear and fascination rise together. Some dismiss everything as coincidence. Others interpret everything as confirmation. Ancient warnings emphasize this split. The return does not produce agreement, it produces contrast. Humanity separates into observers, deniers, interpreters, and seekers. This division is not accidental, it generates data. The signs are also internal, a growing sense that modern explanations feel incomplete, that progress alone does not satisfy, that something essential is missing from the story we tell ourselves about who we are. This unease does not require belief in the Anunnaki or Nibiru. It exists independently, waiting for a framework to attach to. Ancient cycles describe this feeling as the awakening of inherited memory. Another sign is the failure of distraction. Entertainment intensifies, but satisfaction decreases. Noise increases, but meaning thins. Humanity consumes more information than ever and feels less informed. This is not decline, it is saturation. Ancient texts suggest that when distraction stops working, awareness begins. There is also an increase in pattern recognition across unrelated fields. People begin connecting mythology to astronomy, psychology to cosmology, ancient texts to modern data. This interdisciplinary curiosity mirrors ancient modes of understanding that predate specialization. The cycle encourages synthesis. Fragmented knowledge begins to seek structure. The silence discussed earlier amplifies these signs. When expected explanations do not arrive, individuals fill the gap themselves. Curiosity becomes decentralized. Awareness spreads unevenly. Ancient warnings describe this phase as the whispering age, when understanding moves laterally rather than hierarchically. Another subtle sign is the redefinition of humanity's role in the universe. The idea of being central gives way to the idea of being contextual. Humans begin to accept that Earth is part of a larger system, not the focal point of existence. This shift is uncomfortable but necessary. The return challenges anthropocentrism more than survival. The signs also include repetition of language. Words like cycle, reset, return, origin, watcher, and threshold appear across unrelated conversations. This linguistic convergence reflects shared subconscious framing. Ancient cycles note that language aligns before understanding does. Importantly, none of these signs confirm outcomes. They confirm timing. The return does not announce itself with certainty. It announces itself through readiness. Humanity becomes capable of noticing without being capable of agreeing. That state is the signal. The danger is not misinterpretation, it is dismissal of convergence. Any single sign can be explained away. Together, they form a structure. Ancient warnings never relied on singular proof. They relied on accumulation. When enough indicators align, recognition becomes personal rather than institutional. This is why the signs feel subjective. Some people sense them strongly, others feel nothing. Ancient texts explain this disparity as cognitive alignment. Not everyone recognizes patterns at the same threshold. Awareness spreads unevenly by design. The signs we are already seeing do not tell us what will happen next. They tell us where we are in the cycle. They mark a transition from dormancy to activation, from silence to signal, from memory suppression to memory friction. As this narrative continues, we move closer to the final tension, not resolution, but confrontation with uncertainty. The question is no longer whether signs exist, but how humanity responds to recognizing them without consensus or control. Before we move forward, this is where your voice becomes part of the pattern. If you've noticed changes that feel connected rather than random, share that in the comments. You can write phrases like, "The signs are aligning," or "Something is accelerating." And if this deep, slow exploration is keeping you engaged, leaving a like helps this kind of long-form, reflective storytelling reach others who feel that the world is shifting in ways that are difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. There is a moment in every cycle when curiosity crosses a boundary it was never meant to cross, not because the question is forbidden, but because once it is asked sincerely, it cannot be unasked. The Anunnaki understood this better than humanity ever could, and that is why the most dangerous question was never written clearly, never spoken openly, never taught directly. It was left to emerge on its own, at the precise moment when humanity would be capable of forming it without fully understanding the consequences. The question humanity was never meant to ask is not about gods, aliens, or even Nibiru itself. It is far more intimate than that. It is the question of purpose within a cycle. Not who created us, but why were we allowed to continue? Not are we alone, but what role do we serve? This question shifts humanity from observer to participant, from victim to variable. For most of history, humans asked safe questions. How do we survive? How do we worship? How do we explain the unknown in ways that preserve order? These questions strengthened systems. They stabilized societies. They kept attention focused inward. But the ancient warnings suggest that at a certain point in the cycle, humanity begins to ask outward-facing questions instead. Questions that point beyond Earth, beyond history, beyond morality. Questions that do not seek comfort, but structure. This is where the danger lies. Structure reveals limits, and limits reveal design. The Anunnaki did not fear humanity's intelligence. They feared humanity's self-awareness within a system it did not create. A species that understands it is part of a larger mechanism begins to question its own agency. Are our choices truly ours? Are our collapses failures or scheduled resets? Are our civilization's achievements or temporary configurations allowed to exist until conditions change? These questions destabilize everything: politics, religion, progress, identity. They dissolve the illusion of permanence, and permanence is the foundation upon which human meaning is built. The ancient texts hint that previous civilizations approached this question too closely, not through technology, but through pattern recognition. They noticed repetition. They sensed timing. They realized that disasters were not random, that rises and falls followed a rhythm tied to the sky. And when they began to understand that they were not living in history, but inside a cycle, something broke. The Anunnaki responded not with punishment, but with withdrawal. They understood that once the question is asked collectively, collapse accelerates. People stop building for the future if they believe the future is provisional. Authority loses legitimacy. Fear spreads unevenly. Some seek escape, others seek control. The system destabilizes prematurely. This is why the question was never answered directly. Humanity was allowed to approach it asymptotically, close enough to feel its gravity, not close enough to grasp it fully. The question also reframes the idea of survival. Humanity assumes survival is the goal. The ancient records suggest continuity is the goal. There is a difference. Survival implies preservation of the present form. Continuity allows transformation. When humanity asks whether it is meant to survive the return, it assumes that survival is the metric. The Anunnaki's silence implies otherwise. The unasked question then becomes unavoidable. If the cycle resets civilizations but preserves consciousness, what exactly is being refined? This question terrifies because it implies evaluation, not judgment in a moral sense, but assessment. Which traits persist across cycles? Which behaviors lead to collapse? Which structures adapt? Humanity begins to realize it is not simply living history, it is generating data. Once this realization takes hold, even subconsciously, behavior changes. People begin to sense that choices matter differently, not in terms of reward or punishment, but in terms of persistence. What endures beyond collapse? Ideas, stories, genes, awareness? The focus shifts from accumulation to imprint. This shift is already happening. Humans increasingly care about legacy without permanence. Digital memory, cultural impact, genetic survival. We sense, without articulating it, that something will outlast our institutions, but not necessarily our identities. This is not anxiety, it is alignment with the cycle. The question humanity was never meant to ask also challenges the idea of rebellion. If the cycle cannot be stopped, what does resistance mean? If Nibiru's return is a structural function rather than an invasion, who is the enemy? The sky, time, design itself. These questions paralyze traditional narratives of conflict. There is no villain to overthrow, no victory condition to achieve, and this is precisely why the question destabilizes power. Systems depend on solvable problems. An unsolvable structure undermines control. The Anunnaki knew that once humanity asked this question sincerely, guidance would no longer work. Instructions would feel hollow. Authority would feel artificial. Humanity would no longer want answers. It would want context, and context dissolves obedience. This is why the return is accompanied by confusion rather than clarity, why signs appear without explanation, why silence dominates institutions. Humanity must confront the question alone. Each individual, each culture, each generation must decide how to live inside uncertainty without resolution. The question is not meant to be answered, it is meant to be lived with. And that is the true threshold, not knowledge, but tolerance for ambiguity. The Anunnaki's oldest fear was not that humanity would learn too much, but that it would demand certainty where none exists. A species that cannot accept uncertainty becomes destructive. A species that can live within it adapts. This is why the question emerges now rather than earlier. Humanity has reached a point where uncertainty is unavoidable. Science reveals limits. Philosophy offers no closure. Technology accelerates consequences. The illusion of mastery weakens. The question surfaces naturally, not as a thought experiment, but as an existential pressure. Are we meant to survive the return, or are we meant to change because of it? This question reframes everything that came before. The exile, the silence, the warnings, the anomalies. They are no longer mysteries to be solved, but conditions to be navigated. Humanity is not waiting for an answer from the sky. The sky is waiting for a response from humanity, not in words, but in behavior. As this narrative continues, the focus shifts from recognition to response. Not what is returning, but how humanity adapts to knowing that something always does. There is no conclusion here because conclusions imply closure, and closure is not part of the cycle. Before we move forward, this is where your reflection becomes part of the story. If you've ever felt that the biggest questions don't come with answers, only responsibility, share that in the comments. You can write phrases like, "We are part of the cycle," or "The question changes everything." And if you've stayed with this journey through ancient warnings, cosmic patterns, and uncomfortable ideas, leaving a like helps this kind of deep, immersive storytelling reach others who are beginning to sense that the most important question was never meant to be answered, only faced. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, it means you're not just watching, you're thinking. And that matters more than you might realize. So before you leave, take a moment to support this journey. Subscribe to the channel, because what comes next builds directly on everything you've just heard, and you won't want to miss the continuation. If you reach the end, let me know in the comments. You can comment, "I stayed until the end," or "The cycle continues." Those words help signal that this kind of deep, reflective content is resonating. And if this video made you pause, question, or see these ancient mysteries differently, make sure to leave a like. It tells the algorithm to share this story with others who are also searching for meaning beyond the surface. Now don't stop here. The next video is appearing on your screen, and it takes this discussion even deeper. Click it, keep watching, and continue the journey, because this story doesn't end here.